So we started the introduction last week, and whatever we didn't get to, just keep that handy, and it's got all the material there for you to kind of self-study on that introduction. But we will go ahead and start in Obadiah this week. Now, Jimmy, that's a small book in the Old Testament, and you're going to have to get your table of contents to look it up and find it. Before we get going, I'm going to ask Bill to put a map up on the screen because the book of Obadiah talks about a prophet foretelling the destruction of the land of Edom. And if you're like me, you're like, well, I don't know a whole lot about the land of Edom. What in the world is that? And so I wanted to show you on a map. That yellow part down there is the kingdom of Edom, and that little star down there is Petra, which is kind of the modern-day capital of that area. Just to kind of, and we're going to get to our announcements here in just a second, but the guys have a lot of work to do to get ready, and so I just wanted them to put this map up. You can see the Dead Sea there, right just north of the kingdom of Edom. Judah, straight to the left. To the right, you see that MABATU? That's going to be real important here in just a little bit because that is the land that has the final destruction of Edom and under God's authority and plan. Edom is basically, if you take the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea and come straight down and divide the kingdom of Edom in half, you're looking at Jordan and Israel. So it's kind of halfway, right between Jordan and Israel. Matter of fact, if you get your smartphone or your computer when you get home and Google the land of Edom, you'll see a lot of what we're going to talk about today. It's sitting on a mountain range, and the mountain range is about 100 miles by 20 miles wide, 100 miles long, 20 miles wide. And it's basically what they call a red mountain. History has called it the land of the red rock because it is just crimson red. And what the Edomites have done, and we'll get into it here in a little bit, is they went into these mountain clefts and the mountain rocks, and they carved out fortresses and homes and places of worship. And they were really, really high up, and so it gave them a false sense of security when it came time for war and battle and all that. The title of the series is The Judgment of Edom. So how many of you have read the shortest book in the Old Testament? 21 verses, right? For those of you that read the 21 verses, if you're like me, it's kind of a hard read, isn't it? The Bible jumps right into a problem with this land of Eden or this kingdom. And the prophet is talking about things that maybe don't make a lot of sense to us because he uses a lot of visionary language. This is a vision that the prophet has for the upcoming future. So the first thing that I do when I start reading that, I want to put into context, who is this prophet that we're talking about? When was it written, and what's kind of happening in the day that has upset the relationship between God and this group of people or this kingdom? Okay, so number one, let's just kind of go down the list here. Obadiah is the prophet of the book, and Obadiah means the servant of Yahweh, or the servant of Jehovah, or the servant of the Lord. Not an uncommon name in the Old Testament. Through our study, we find that there are some 13 people in the Old Testament that go by this name, Obadiah. And there's been many scholars that have tried to link this particular Obadiah with one of the other Obadiahs. You know, for instance, is this the same Obadiah that was Ahab's steward? You remember the Obadiah that actually hid the 100 prophets and protected them in the book of 1 Kings. We talked about that not too long ago when Ahab's wife Jezebel was on her rampage. There's also the Obadiah that was sent by Jehoshaphat to teach the new law in Judah in 2 Chronicles 17. And there was also an Obadiah who's one of the overseers in repairing the temple under Josiah. I think the reason why I wanted to bring this up is the book itself, Obadiah, doesn't give us any kind of information as to who exactly this Obadiah is. Doesn't give us any of his character, the characteristics, anything like that. So there's really no way that we can accurately say that this Obadiah was one of those other 13. There's no way of definitively linking them. And so when you can't definitively link it, I don't feel very comfortable in saying this was another Obadiah in Scripture. For all we know, this is a one-time mention of this gentleman, and he was sent by God to deliver a message, not to the nation of Israel. This book is not to get on or reprimand the nation of Israel. This book was written to comfort the nation of Israel, the land of Judah, in that there is a kingdom out there that is hurting you, that God sees and God knows, and God has a plan to eliminate that kingdom from history. So the book was written not to, most of the prophets were to talk to Israel specifically, Judah, about certain problems that they were having, to reprimand them and call them back to order. This book was written about a reprimand from another kingdom to give solace to the land of Judah, if that makes sense. A little background and information. There is an ancient Jewish historian who labeled Edom as a rose-red city half as old as time. A rose-red city. And one of the reasons for that is because the Edom actually means the red region. So what's going on with this red? If you look up on your pictures or your maps on your smartphones and you look up the land of Edom, you'll see, and we talked about it a minute ago, it's crimson red is the rocks around this area. It's really an interesting region. And so historians have always referred to it as the red region. 2 dates on when this book, Obadiah, was written. Ladies and gentlemen, there is absolutely no way for me to stand up here or any other scholar, and I'm not one of those, by the way, but any other Bible historian or scholar to stand up here and tell you that they know exactly when this book was written. What we can say is it was probably written somewhere between 850 BC and 500 BC. Okay, about a 350 year span. The information contained in the book doesn't give us any kind of definitive date on what was happening in that certain event or that region. All we know is that there is going to be destruction coming to a people. And we know that that destruction came in a series of events culminating all the way up to about 300 BC. Okay? So there's a couple of things here. The prophet refers to an attack on Jerusalem. There was a big attack in the days of Jehoram from 848 to 844 when the Philistines and the Arabians attacked the city. But probably, I would say, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 is paramount to what this author is foretelling. Okay? There is no mention of the destruction of the temple, the deportation to Babylon, and the remnant who went to Egypt. Now, it says here we accept the early date that it was around 845 BC. Feel free to mark through that if that doesn't make you comfortable. Okay? Because it could be anywhere from 500 to 850. I guess my point being, it really doesn't matter. And the reason why it doesn't matter is because when you study these Old Testament minor prophets, what we really want to focus on is what is the message in this book and how does it apply to us today? Because what we're going to find out is people don't change. These people that were living in Edom and doing these things to their brethren are the same type people that are sitting in this room right here today. And as we dig into it, we're going to find God had a major problem with Edom because of two things. Because of their pride and because of their lack of brotherliness to their neighbor. Shocker, right? Sounds just like the United States of America in 2018. Let's go back in time just a little bit. Who were these Edomites? Does anybody know? Descendants of Esau. Okay, that takes us back even farther. Okay, so who was Esau? And who was that? Does anybody want to take a little quick 15-second stab at how the descendants of Esau and all that came about? Jacob's brother. So if we remember, way back in the Old Testament, do you remember when Jacob and Esau were born from their mother and they were the twins that came out? And when they came out, Jacob was holding on to Esau's leg. And Jacob came out first. Esau came out first. Jacob came out second. Why is that important? Because the firstborn had rights, didn't he? The firstborn back in this time period had all kinds of economic rights to the family's fortune, and they had certain blessings that they were entitled to. And as these brothers grew up, they were a little bit different, weren't they? Jacob was the favorite of his mother, and Esau was the favorite of his father. That's kind of odd to us as parents, right? We typically don't want to say that we have a favorite son or daughter. But the Bible's very clear on that. And then one day, Esau had been out in the field, and he was hungry, remember? And Jacob was cooking. And he says, hey, give me a bowl of that food. And what did Jacob tell him? I'll give you this food if you give me your rights. Right? And what you can summarize as the non-deep thinker of Esau, most people, would you take that deal? Nobody would, right? Well, he did. He jumped right at it. Said, okay, that doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Give me some food. All of a sudden, it kind of kept moving forward. And then the dad got sick, remember? And he was blind, and the dad couldn't see. And so there was a kind of a scheme developed from the mother and Jacob. Remember, Jacob came in and he put on kind of a coat there that felt woolly. And he went in, and what did he receive from his dad? He received the firstborn's blessing. Okay, now that is a big deal. And so did Esau like that when he found out what had happened? Esau decided to do what to him? He decided to kill him. And all of a sudden there was a split, right? Jacob had to flee. And we know what happened in that time. He went over and worked at Laban's house. And remember, he kind of got cheated. He worked 7 years to marry this daughter of Laban who he always, he thought was so beautiful. And then what did Laban do after 7 years? He gave him enough, he'd worked enough to have the money for the dowry, as we would say. But then he gave him the different daughter. He says, whoa, this isn't the daughter that I've been working for 7 years. He says, well, I'll give you the one you want if you work another 7 years. So time goes by. 20 years goes by. And all of a sudden, after 20 years, we see this what looks to be a reconciliation between Jacob and Esau, don't we? It was time to mend the fences. It was time to put the grudge down. And 20 years later, they kind of orchestrate this meeting. Remember, both of them were a little skeptical, right? But they meet, and they basically, Jacob and his brother Esau, they have a reconciliation. I would submit to you that that reconciliation was not as complete as we may think, because Jacob still didn't trust Esau. After that reconciliation, they were supposed to go together down to where the Bible says Mount Seir. Do you remember it talks about going to Mount Seir? Mount Seir was one of the high mountains, places of worship in Edom, because that's where Esau's descendants were. Well, he ends up not ever going. So, long story short, that division between Jacob and Esau festered its way down all the way through where you see the nation of Edom at odds with the nation of Judah and the nation of Israel. And so, although they were what we would say cousins, they didn't treat each other like they were cousins. They really didn't like each other very much. You say, well, why? We know it goes back to the history that the brothers had, but I would submit to you that it also goes back to some economic interest. A lot of the fights that people have today are over what? Money. The same thing back then. Edom had a very interesting highway that ran right through it. It's called the King's Highway. The King's Highway would take not only land trade, but also ship and merchant trade from the Mediterranean Sea and also those gulfs. Bakwa, I think, is that gulf to the right. If you look on your map, you'll see right above Egypt, you'll see the Persian Gulf on the left. And I think it's the Bakwa Gulf or something like that on the right. All that trade would come up and it would hit the King's Highway and cut right through the land of Edom. And so it was on a trade route. And so that was a lot of the financial stimulus for the nation. As time went on, those trade routes kind of moved north. And they moved up north into Judah. And so you saw a transfer of some of the money and the wealth from the nation of Edom up to Judah. Now at the same time, something really interesting was discovered in the kingdom of, I keep saying the nation of Edom, but the kingdom of Edom. Something was discovered. Does anybody know what mineral was discovered in Edom? Copper. Copper was discovered on the western side of Edom. And that was a source of great mining and wealth for this territory. Okay? So if you look at Edom, you're looking at a nation that's got money. They have kind of a fortress mentality because they're living up on the top of these mountain spans. And they carve their houses and they carve their temples and their places of worship and their military posts actually into the rock. And if you pull it up on your smartphone and you put the land of Edom, you'll see how they did this. There's tons of pictures out there. And if you want to type in Petra, you'll see some illustrations of that as well. But they were high up in the mountain, completely guarded. They were very, very fortified. They had a lot of money. And then at the same time, they were able to go to all those nations around them and form really extreme friendships. Okay? So their loyalty was to who? Their loyalty was to themselves, to their money, and to the nations around them that they could buy off for security, basically. And so as the nation of Judah started running into problems, everybody hated them, right? They were always getting invaded. They were always involved in conflict. Well, guess who was doing that? It starts back up with the Assyrians in 850 BC. It comes on down. The Arabs were doing it a little in the mid-centuries. And then all of a sudden the Babylonians come in 500s, right? Guess what happened? And this is paramount to understand. Guess what happened when the Babylonians invaded Judah? Not only did the land of Edom or the Edomites see that happening, after the Babylonians came in and the war was going on, the Edomites came in behind them and actually plundered some of the cities. So they came in there and started robbing the possessions from their own cousins. And Obadiah talks about how they stood back and they actually made fun of Judah. They sat back on the sidelines and they saw them suffering. And the Edomites actually went in and were helping to cause that suffering and mocking them and making fun of them. And so, as any time there's war going on, what do we see in modern day? When a country, and we see it in the Middle East all the time, when a country gets invaded by an evil force, what do a lot of the citizens actually do? They flee, right? They get out. And we see it on the news all the time where we see these long lines of refugees, is what we call them, trying to get to a different country. Judah had that same thing. And there was a long line of these refugees. Guess where they wanted to come? They wanted to come down to Edom. What do you think the Edomites did? They stopped them. They stood in the gap. They would not let them come in. They made them go back. So they wouldn't even help them. And that's pretty consistent because we find out if we look way back into the Old Testament. Do you remember when the nation of Israel was wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years? You know, they upset God. They couldn't go to the promised land because of what happened. And God made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Well, part of that time, they wanted to go through and travel through the land of Edom. Guess what happened then? Edomites said no. And so all of this keeps happening to the point where Obadiah now writes his book. So that's a little bit of the history as to why we have this book in Obadiah and why God is upset at these Edomites. And so when we get right down to it, God is upset at the pride of the Edomites, and He's upset because they're not treating the nation of Judah as brothers and sisters. And He is fed up with it. And the book goes into great detail to let us know today that God was in control of the nations and the lives of men in 850 maybe BC, and He's in control of the lives of men today. Nothing has changed. So let's look a little bit of... Let's go to the second page here. I kind of got rambling there a little bit. I got to find myself. Let's look at Romans. Yes, sir. So the question is, at the end of the day, were the Edomites completely annihilated, number one? And the answer is yes. And we're going to talk about that as we go down here in just a second, because we're going to find that. It's also important to know what the kings of Israel, how they feared in all this. And Saul came to the conversation just a second ago. Saul had problems with it. The Bible goes on to tell us that King David actually conquered the land. But then the Bible goes on to tell us that it was Solomon who actually exploited the land. And what we're led to believe there is King David conquered it. Solomon actually really geared up the economic engine, especially in the copper mining of that region. So he really profited off of that capture by David. The outline of the book. The coming judgment of Edom. The decree has gone forth to the nations in 1:1. The decree basically saying, this is what's going to happen. The prophet Obadiah is foretelling. I have a vision. This is what's going to happen. I'm going to lay it out for you. Edomites are deceived by pride in their location, and Edom will be brought down. The destruction will be complete. Edom will be betrayed by its allies. This is really interesting. God chose to destroy this region of people, the Edomites, not by using Judah. God chose to destroy them by using their own allies who they had trust in. Okay? Now you're talking about God works in the lives of men. So He not only took their best friends, but convinced their best friends to come in and wipe them off the face of the earth. Because if you get right down to it, we see the principle today. Let's take members of a crime organization. If I'm a criminal, and my best friend's another criminal, and I have another best friend that's a criminal, do you think there's a lot of loyalty between those criminals and me? Follow the money most of the time, right? If I'm walking around with a bunch of $100 bills hanging out of my pocket, one of those guys is probably going to knock me over the head and take my money, because that's what they do. And that's exactly how God used the allies of Edom in this situation. Number 5 says, not even wisdom and might can save them. It's kind of an interesting thing there in Obadiah 1:8 and 9. Not even wisdom and might. See, they relied heavily. The Edomites relied very heavily on their own wise men. They had wise men. That they were their scholars. And they relied heavily on their instruction. No one is wiser than God. The reason for judgment on Edom, verses 10 through 16, for violence and unbrotherly conduct toward Jacob. Now think about that. It goes all the way back from when they were wandering in the wilderness and wouldn't let them come through their land. It comes all the way forward until Judah is getting plundered, or will get plundered. And the Edomites come in behind and assist with that plundering. And then won't even allow the refugees to escape. Obadiah 1:15 and 16 talks about the day of the Lord is coming. The day of the Lord is a term that's used in the Old Testament, the New Testament, all throughout the Bible. When you read the day of the Lord, what do you think about? Judgment. The judgment day is coming. Well, guess what? In the Old Testament, the same thing. The judgment of the Lord is coming. Now, we have the ability to look back into time on the Old Testament and know that they're just maybe talking about 2 days of the Lord in this instance. The day of the Lord talking about the day when the Edomites will be completely wiped off the face of the earth. But then there's also the day of the Lord coming, that the reconciliation, at the final judgment, between those Edomites that maybe somehow convert can go to heaven when they die through the blood of Jesus Christ that comes all the way forward and all the way back. Now, they had no way of knowing that, right? That's even a little bit tough for some of our young folks to understand, how the blood of Christ can reach back into times before to cleanse people so they can have eternity with God. But we know, as Bible students know, that that's part of this vision as well. They were looking for the Messiah. Absolutely. No doubt. The fulfillment of the prophecy at the very bottom of page 2. It's immediate fulfillment. Edom's destruction began with the Babylonian invasion and Nebuchadnezzar around 600 BC. It continued into the 4th century BC with the invasion of the Arabs, known as the, and I'm terrible with these, Nabateans, forcing them to a region south of Judah. You remember when we looked at the map and I said, remember this Nabatean people on the right? As you can see, God used that nation to come and invade the Edomites. In the 2nd century BC, the Maccabees brought them under subjection when Judah's Maccabees slew 20,000 of them. That period of time we know is happened during the period of time when the Bible is completely silent between the Old Testament and New Testament. If my memory's right, I think it's about 400 years. Is that right? 400 years. The Bible goes silent for a period of time. Between the final books of the Old Testament and Matthew, 400 years go by. A lot of times we call that the Maccabean period. And what we do know about that, although the Bible is silent, what we do know is there's Jewish historians, Josephus being one, several other ones, that have detailed accounts of that period of time. And then there was a gentleman named John Hyrcanus, I guess is his name. From the period of time from 134 to 101 BC, he forced the remnant to accept circumcision of the law. So there was a small group of people that were left of these Edomites because they had been getting whittled down, right? Getting invaded, getting killed. All of a sudden there's whatever remnant was left. This gentleman came and basically forced them into Jewish law with circumcision. Letter B. Its ultimate fulfillment may likely have been with the coming of the Messiah. And that's what David was just talking about. The ultimate fulfillment just may have been with the coming of Messiah. Because who were they looking for? They were looking for the Messiah. For the lack of time, we're going to go down here. There's a lot of information about in letter B that I'll let you kind of study on your own there. Because I want to get to something in the last 10 minutes or so that I think is important. When we study these Old Testament prophets, it's important for us to understand what brought the book into existence. That's why we've spent some time with the history. But what is Obadiah really telling us today? He's saying that pride in not treating your brother or sister the way you're supposed to angers God and disappoints God. That's the lesson for us here. We talk a lot from the pulpit about those two things. And we talk about it a little bit differently from the perspective that we're given here. We know that pride leads to vanity and a sense of independence from God. Isn't that true? When we have pride in our heart instead of God in our heart, don't we all of a sudden start thinking that we can do it alone? We don't really need anything else. We're smart enough in business to make enough money to buy the things we want to make us happy. We're smart enough how to deal with people, so I'm going to always kind of get what I want, and at the end of the day, I'm going to come out on top. And I'm going to leverage people so I can always win. I'm going to surround myself with friends that are going to protect me. Doesn't it sound like these Edomites? And when the Edomites went into that line of thought over centuries of behavior, look at what it turned out to be. It turned out to be that I don't need my brothers and sisters anymore because I have built around me my new set of friends that are going to take care of me. And if my brothers and sisters need help, I now don't have time for them anymore. That's not important to me. Their goals in life I don't care about anymore because I'm worried about myself. And I've spent all this time trying to get myself lined up where I know that I'm going to be successful. And I don't care about y'all. And God has had it with that line of thought. And that's what Obadiah is telling us here. There's a history lesson with the geography and all that. But that's the lesson that we have to get, is we have to divest ourselves with pride, and we have to learn to love our brothers and sisters and make what's important to them important to us. Does that make sense? Yes, sir?
That reminds me of another verse of Scripture. As we therefore have opportunity to do good to all, especially to those of the household of faith.
Right. There's something special about the people in this room. True? You got up this morning. Lord willing, thank you. We're able to come to a place with like minds where we all kind of want the same goal. And what God is saying, these are the people that you need to surround yourself. Because when you start stepping off and doing something wrong, these are the people that are going to come help you out. The false friends that you have in the world will not, because they don't care. Kimberly and I laugh all the time. We have friends that every now and then will fall into a bad spot. Everybody's got those, right? Nobody lives in a bubble. And we tell our friends all the time, just take a deep breath. This is going to pass faster than you think, because at the end of the day, the world only cares about themselves. They don't really care that you're having XYZ problem or that you did XYZ. It's hot news today, but in the reality, the world is so worried about themselves, they don't have time to think about you. Where this group of people is completely different. We're all tugging on the same rope. If we can get everybody on the same rope and pull, then we all end up at the same place. And where is that? The Bible calls it a place like heaven or Mount Zion. And we'll, with a couple of minutes left, this is where we're going in the last page. Where are we going? When we take Obadiah's advice and we divest ourselves with pride and we surround ourselves with brothers and sisters and we love them, where are we going to end up? Right here at number 3. The city of the living God. The heavenly Jerusalem. An innumerable company of angels, the firstborn registered in heaven, will arrive at God, the judge of all, the spirits of men made perfect, Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and the sprinkling of the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. Of course, this is what we come to as we obey the gospel of Christ. That's the lesson in Obadiah. Can we divest ourselves from pride? And can we be committed to treat our brothers and sisters as God treats us? Not a bad little book for 21 verses in the Old Testament, right? Next week, we will attack the book of Joel. Joel. Jimmy, it's in the Old Testament, kind of close to where that is. And we're going to spend 2 weeks talking about Joel. So if you want to do a little pre-reading and get ready for that, and then we'll continue our study. Thank y'all for coming.